Good morning. Welcome to this session of ProMat, where we're going to talk about S&OP. And we're going to talk specifically about the role of integrated sales and operations planning and also integrated business planning and its effect on inventory, profitability, and overall supply chain resiliency and actual overall corporate performance. Okay. So with that, let's jump right to it. So, I've done a number of, a couple hundred consulting projects in my career, and I've done turnarounds, where we've taken unprofitable companies and turned them profitable. And one of the best ways to do that, to improve corporate performance, is to improve the planning process. What do we buy? What do we sell? What's our forecast? How do we make sure we've got the right manufacturing plan or buying plan? How do we know that we've got the warehouses staffed correctly? How do we make sure that we have our stores planned effectively? And all that should really come out of an effective planning process, commonly known as sales and operations planning, sometimes also known as integrated business planning. And we'll talk about that today. Some of the things that are important is, how do you get started into this? How do you build that muscle that exists inside your business? The other one is, how do you expand your capabilities to deal with disruptions and other challenges that will happen in your business? Who should be involved in this process? How does it operate? And obviously, one of the more important pieces, which is, what are the KPIs for success? How do we know we're doing this correctly? And how do we know when it's time to do something different? And then I'll go through a case study and give several examples. So, I work, I'm the SVP of consulting in Avista. And in Avista, we always think about this in terms of a physical and digital and how they operate together. So S&OP in business planning is a perfect connection of these two, right? I've got typically physical things I'm trying to plan, and I support that through my digital infrastructure and systems. And how do I create a very efficient way to do that? Because this needs to be data driven, and the outputs need to be things that there's some level of automation or efficiency in the process. And combining those two creates the most effective world-class operations in your company. So you think I'll go back to the history of this. There used to be corporate planning before my days, where there's a lot of corporate top-down planning. You build your 2-year plans and 3-year plans, and then 12 months, and then week to week, and you manufacture it in a more supply-driven, more predictable. And then, when the consumer revolution of the 80s started creating some changes in demand patterns, it became more obviously demand-driven and consumer-driven, and then based on that, it created more complexity in the planning process. And so to adapt to that, you've seen where folks are, companies were trying to balance the supply and demand in basic ways, not necessarily data-driven. It wasn't the robustness of data that we have today, but they had historicals and they were leveraging that. And then when you get into the 90s, that's when technology really started helping. Typically in the late 90s, when technology really came in, was able to pull, recent data, point of sale data, or recent trends, and be able to combine that to maybe some other regional or global pieces of information to enable companies to plan better and forecast. Also around that time, supply chains started extending globally. So on the one hand, there was more data, more information, but the flip side of it is it became much more complicated to plan because of extended supply chains and long cycle times. And then when we get to the 2000s, we really got much better technologies in order to help us plan and manage more cross-functional capabilities or build inside of businesses. But the other thing that's important is, companies are able to leverage collaboration. A lot of companies that, have led the way in creating partnerships with the suppliers so that they have access to real-time or near-time information in order so that suppliers can plan to kind of level out that bullwhip effect that happens inside your supply chain. So where we are today is obviously, we've made this path, but because of COVID and tariffs and other disruptions that have happened in the marketplace, and the supply plans, everything has been stretched. When you think about S&OP, you're really trying to balance supply and demand, and there's some obvious challenges to that. What if my demand is becoming more unpredictable? If I move more to the online channel, that online channel is typically more volatile. It has less constraints, and consumers are able to access worldwide, and there are demand patterns that will change they're very difficult to predict. And then on the supply side, you have a number of interesting challenges there. I have clients with problems with, volcanoes, typhoons, tariffs, and everything we know about around pandemics and other challenges. And so trying to balance between those two is becoming more and more difficult over time. And I don't know that trend will ever change. It would probably continue to get worse over time. The more the companies shift into different channels, the more different competitors they run into, the more challenges they're going to run into trying to predict what will happen on the demand side. And I think we're all familiar with some of the issues with COVID. Shifts in sourcing that are happening, and we have a number of clients and companies that are shifting their supply bases around the world, which creates more challenges in lead time and difficult to plan. The capacity issues, especially with labor and in manufacturing. A lot of companies have been challenged with trying to reposition inventory based on the new demand patterns related to COVID. Then you've got the interesting challenges around transportation shortages and constraints. It's almost a perfect storm, right? That's happened. But none of these are brand new problems. They're problems that existed in the past that COVID really amplified significantly. And so, I think one of the ways to kind of look at this is, this is something that happened in the past, was a small problem, and now it's a huge problem. So how do we deal with that? One of the ways we have to deal with it is, how do we plan differently? I was in the Army many years ago. We had a very specific type of planning cycle. When you had longer term planning cycles, and then you have very short, rapid planning cycles, because the situation on the battlefield could change immediately. Same thing inside of companies. Situations can change very quickly. So how do I adapt and react to that? And it doesn't matter if it's COVID or a hurricane or a snowstorm. All those things would create those sort of tight decision cycles that require an integrated approach. Some of the challenges we tend to run into frequently, one is, what is the right forecast? Who owns the forecast? And if I have very different data points coming in, which one do I use? And how do I reconcile that, right? So a consensus forecast is one of the more difficult things a company does, honestly, and getting that accurate. One of the things that's common challenge is the sort of communications. You get a piece of information from a customer. Who do you tell, and what do they do with that information? How is that shared, right? So we're trying to build a collective decision process in S&OP. So that communication of, here's a new data point, how do I share that? It's a very common challenge. We do have another number of clients, and there are a lot of companies out there that are chasing supply. I mean, they've run out, and they're trying to figure out, how do I build capacity? What do I can't fill all these orders. I can't manage all this demand. How do I optimize against that? And one of I think the difficult things S&OP is, companies are often siloed functionally, right? So they build that skill set, but then how do those silos interact so that they create collective decision making? And, there are two ways to make decisions: reactive, proactive. And if it's proactive, that means I've got data. The data comes in at the right time, and I can see a trend in a direction, and I can be proactive about being able to anticipate. Reactive is it's already happened, and I have to react to it, and I have to scramble and adjust, right? And so So again, a lot of the things that happened recently in the marketplace have pushed clients to become reactive. And what we want to make sure is we have a process that enables us to be proactive in their supply chain. And one of the things is, what are some of the challenges we have? I mean, what are the data-driven analysis that says, here's cause and effect. We're not hitting our service levels because of production delays or vendor delays or snowstorm, whatever that is, right? Let's identify what the challenges might be. And then, what does good look like? That's always an important thing to figure out. Where are you going and what should you have in terms of forecast accuracy, inventory levels, service levels to your customers, right? So you always think about customers first and how I'm going to satisfy them, and what is the best way to do that based on inventory, and work my way backwards to fill in those gaps. What's causing the delay and what are the gaps in me servicing that, right? And that's a great foundation to start. So then, from a collective communication, here's some of the challenges we have to overcome as a cross-functional team in the S&OP process, okay? Forecast accuracy is a fun thing to look at, and the faster growing companies are in a great spot, but they also tend to have the most forecast and accuracy challenges. But one of the things that's important is to understand the bias that exists inside of forecasting and understand the types of opportunities that exist by improving forecast accuracy. So a tremendous number of clients is just an example of some analysis where we took a look at the faster moving versus slower moving items, understand what the inventory levels are and inventory values, and saying, where do they have good forecast accuracy versus poor. And then it helps you sort of diagnose and say, where is my low hanging fruit? Where can I focus and make an improvement? You can't solve these problems across the board. You can't boil the ocean. You have to focus and say, hey, look, here's the problem we run into, or here's an area where we think we can create improvement. How do we design a process to focus on that first? And once we have that, we build that. There's no perfection that exists in sales and operations planning. It is a continuous improvement. You'll make stepwise changes, but it's a muscle you have to build over time. It's a skill set. When I first did this in the apparel industry in the 90s, I could tell you, we had serious demand swings. It was difficult, and it took us, about a year, 9 months to a year to get it, to figure out how we want the changes we want to make and build that. And we started with this type of analysis to understand where are problems, but then to build the muscle so that everyone knows what data to make what decisions with was a very, very interesting challenge. And it takes time, right? But it's very worthwhile investment. When you take a look at the objectives you have, there's several things that are very important. One of them is translate a forecast into something you can do something with. If you have an effective process, you should drive your business, not just your planning, not just your buying, not just manufacturing. It should drive the business. Where's the forecast? Where are we going? We have a gap against what we want to do. Okay, well, we make a change and understand how we want to adjust the sales. But then once we know what that is, then what are we going to do? And how are we going to do it efficiently? And how are we going to hang on to those customers and be competitive? The thing that these processes should do is they have to be market responsive. You have to be able to make decisions rapidly and be proactive against the changes that exist in demand patterns. You have to try something and follow it all the way through to know if it worked. And that's one challenge is companies don't make a decision and follow the way through. So they don't know, did it work, did it not work? It's got to be data driven. You have to have the right data, and you have to know, based on this data, here's what I'm going to do, and share that information. The other thing that's also very important is making sure the ownership, right? The sales own the forecast. Do they have the information on that forecast? And if they do, what are the implications if they don't hit the forecast? And accountability is a term that's misused, but accountability means we've given them what they need to be successful. That's one thing that's very important. And if they're not successful, it's everybody's job to make sure they have what they need, right? And it's important from an ownership standpoint to do that. From planning levels, there's one of the things that's commonly missed, right? Typically, sales and operations planning is a monthly cycle. It's very common to have a monthly cycle. Occasionally, there are weekly cycles, but predominantly it's a monthly cycle. You think about it, it kind of fits between the strategic planning that happens typically annually or in a rolling 12 and the weekly cycles that happen week to week for either production planning, retail planning, whatever it is. Okay. And they fit in between that. And what they do is they take that strategic plan and they get information down to the weekly side to allow them to become more efficient, more competitive, and serve the customers better. Okay. And thing that you always want to strive for is the advanced level of integrated business planning. So again, there's no stepwise change. You flip a switch and this works. It's a muscle you build over time, but it can drive your business. It is a difference between success and failure, and it can drive tremendous amount of profitability and competitive advantage done correctly. But I encourage everyone to leverage this type of skill to help plan your entire business. Right? Get the financial people and the other and the folks who make long-term plans should really be connected to this process and help you drive your business in the right direction. There are a lot of important metrics and KPIs that drive sales and operations planning. Start simple and add complexity over time. They have to be accurate. You have to be able to measure it and make sure it makes sense, right? This is a data-driven process. You need data to determine success and failure. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you start with customer-facing metrics first and work your way backwards. If you get chargebacks, if you have delayed deliveries, challenges from a customer perspective and complaints, start there. Always start there. Make sure you got the metrics to satisfy your customers, and then work your way back into what are the metrics that will, drive our business and make us more successful over time. Okay. So again, I've personally done many of these, either as running the operation of a business in very large companies down to smaller companies, and then consulting is very common. And most of these case studies tell the same exact story, which is, hey, look, we have customer complaints, and that's normally the first thing that pops up. We have customer complaints, low fill rates, out of stocks, and when you dig into it, you find out you have bad forecasts, you're not good communication, you're using the wrong technology, or it's not set up correctly. But then the solutions, right, is typically taking a look at how do we apply the process to the type of business and characteristics that I have. So one thing you have to be careful with is there's not a one size fits all solution to this. If I have very different types of inventory characteristics or different types of items, different types of stores, I may need variations of the process to support them. I may need different approaches to forecast one type of item versus another type. And so it's important to understand the different types you want to have into these different businesses. And then from there, then you design the process that supports that. And then you build that cross-functional team, data-driven, to have the right process to support the right type of forecasting and planning. Okay. And the results are usually relatively dramatic. Usually in the first 6 months, you get fairly significant results. Whatever your gap is, you can fill about half that gap in 6 months, typically. And then after that, it's a continuous improvement approach, and it may take another year, 18 months to fill the rest of the gap if that's what you're going for. Most of these improvement processes don't require significant investment in technology. Most companies don't use their forecasting planning technology well to begin with, but it is sometimes necessary to add technology for improvement. Making sure you understand the issues, make sure I've got the right data is very important, but determining the gaps that you have and filling those gaps through process changes are critical to get started. It takes some time to really make progress. You want to get momentum, and you got to get cross-functional adoption. So that takes some time to get everybody on board. But you have to think about it as, here, I have my strategic direction, and then tactical things that I'm going to accomplish in the near term that's going to get me moving. And I think it's important. Look, it's data driven. You have to do the analysis to understand where are my gaps, what are the characteristics, so I can apply the right process to improve overall planning processes, and make sure that you stick to it. it doesn't hit right away. It takes a little bit of time, so you stay focused on it. And once it catches, that's the term I use. Once it starts going, it'll get momentum on its own, and you'll see significant results. I'll happy to take any questions or anything else at this time.